Hey guys! Welcome to Social Studies with Miss Rogers, World History Edition. World War I finally ended, which means our next steps are going to take us to the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles had one goal: to keep such a terrible war, such as World War I, from ever happening again. Unfortunately, though, there are so many strong feelings in the room while making this treaty, their goal of peace is corrupted by fear. Today, we're going to look exactly at what the Treaty of Versailles proposed and how it impacted the countries involved. So, let's get started. When we looked at the end of the war in our last class, we saw the struggle of battle became too much for Russia, and they had to withdraw, which potentially could have been devastating for the Allies. Fortunately for them, the United States was able to fill those gaps with fresh troops, supplies, weapons, and help deliver the final blow the Allies needed to end the war. Now that World War I was over, it was time to think about the world's next steps. The biggest players on the Allies' side of the war led what would be called the Paris peace talks at the Palace of Versailles in France. These big players included Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, George Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Vittorio Orlando, a statesman of Italy. These men came to the meetings with very different ideas of what peace meant and what peace for the world should look like, as did the other voices who attended the meetings, meaning finding a good balance of fairness was going to be very difficult. President Wilson of the United States created the 14 points, a list of things he expected would make the world a safer place and keep things like World War I from happening again. President Wilson's wishes really centered around preserving democratic ideas and letting people have a voice in their government. He supported free trade, open seas, and this idea of self-determination. Self-determination meant that people within a nation would have a right to determine the style of government that would encompass their nation without external factors getting in the way. Most of all, President Woodrow Wilson urged the creation of a League of Nations. The League of Nations would be an international association with the sole goal of keeping peace in the world. Even though Wilson loved the idea of a League of Nations, his country didn't necessarily agree with him. They still believed in isolationism, to keeping to themselves and staying out of European affairs. Remember, the US did not join World War I until it threatened America directly. Other nations, such as France and England, were also not the biggest fan of Woodrow Wilson's ideas. France and England were more concerned about their own national security and making sure that Germany wouldn't be a giant threat anymore. You have to remember that while America did lose precious lives, they were years late to the party. They didn't lose nearly as many lives as the British and the French, who had been in this war for years. These nations were much more interested in making Germany pay, specifically Germany because Germany did most of the damage out of all of the Central Powers. Not only were nations such as France and Great Britain angry with Germany, but they were scared of Germany. Germany had become extremely powerful during the war. If it wasn't for the Americans, when Russia backed out, there was certainly a chance that the Central Powers would win. Germany held off both fronts with half of their army at each, which is a pretty scary thought for these European leaders. So again, their main goal is to punish and strip Germany to the point that they are no longer a threat. You have to remember all of the death and destruction that some of these nations experienced. America was very fortunate being across the world. The war was not in their backyard. Other nations didn't have that luxury. How scared, upset, and paranoid would you be if this happened in our country, to your homes, to your friends? Out of these peace talks would come many treaties, because you need one for each of the Central Powers. The most famous treaty to come out of the Paris peace talks would be the treaty made with Germany, the Treaty of Versailles. It's easy to remember the big points of Germany's punishments with the acronym BRAT. Germany was treated like a bratty child, and it serves as a great mnemonic device. The war guilt clause in the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany was given the full blame for the war. This was pretty controversial for many reasons. On one hand, Germany did start setting up all of the alliances early on. Not only that, but Germany was clearly ready to go to war, declaring war on both Russia and France before either of them made an official move. Sure, Russia mobilized troops, but they didn't declare war on anybody, not even Austria-Hungary, and one could argue they were just trying to scare Austria-Hungary into leaving Serbia alone. But Germany was very quick to jump into the war unprovoked and caused the most damage out of all of the Central Powers by far. On the other hand, the Germans had nothing to do with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The Germans had nothing to do with the unfair demands that Austria-Hungary gave to Serbia. The Germans had nothing to do with the Austro-Hungarians refusing to negotiate with Serbia. The Germans had nothing to do with Russia being the first to mobilize their army, their large army, mind you. Germany was not the first, second, or third country to involve themselves in this conflict. The idea of the war guilt clause was a very controversial issue, but it was one the French and the British felt very strongly about. Because they were blamed for the war, Germany was responsible for reparations, paying money to make amends and pay for damages that was considered their fault. Germany would have to pay $33 billion in reparations to the Allied nations. That's a lot. To ease Great Britain and France's mind, Germany also had a restriction placed on their army. They were limited to only have 100,000 men in their army, and they were not allowed to have submarines or planes. And finally, Germany lost a lot of territory. Germany lost land in Europe to make new nations such as Poland, and even lost the Alsace-Lorraine. That was the land France lost in the Franco-Prussian War. The Germans had to give it back to the French, so you know that made them mad. The Germans also lost their colonies overseas. The Allies would rule their colonies until it was deemed they could rule themselves. Now, no one at the Paris peace talks present was there to represent Germany. Germany had no voice in these discussions. I just find it ironic how when we talked about imperialism, Germany hosted a conference, the Berlin Conference, in which they allowed nations all over the world to decide Africa's fate, while Africa had no say in the matter, and, well, now Germany is having its fate decided by foreign nations without having a say in the matter. It's fine. The other Central Powers didn't have their voices heard either. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire was split up between new countries like Austria and Hungary. Wow, those are creative names. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, those are much more creative. Also, the Ottomans lost most of their empire, and the Middle East was carved up into smaller nations split between France and Great Britain. France received Syria and Lebanon, while Great Britain received Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan. And this land ownership will become very significant when we get into the more modern issues, such as, issues in the Gaza Strip, maybe? Even Russia, who was not present, partly because they were dealing with their own civil war issues, and also partly because they left the war early, lost some territory. This map shows the differences in how Europe looked before World War I and after World War I. You can clearly see there was a lot of changes in land ownership, meaning there was probably a lot of bitter feelings over these treaties. And can we take a second for the round 2 of land in Africa just being tossed around until the Europeans decided these people are capable of ruling themselves without local feedback? No one is safe from the anger these treaties create. The only happy person here is Woodrow Wilson, because the Treaty of Versailles does include the creation of the League of Nations, his baby. But all of his happiness is sucked away as well when the rest of his country is like, we told you we hate this idea, and refuse to ratify it. So the US doesn't even join the League of Nations. It's fine. They say the Treaty of Versailles was a treaty built on quicksand. Just seeing the losses the Central Powers faced, it's understandable why they held such anger and hatred in their hearts. Even those a part of the Allied powers who didn't receive as much as their larger counterparts left the Paris peace talks angry that they didn't get more than they felt they deserved. Italy and Japan would be prime examples of nations who felt they were cheated. Japan only joined the war to gain territory in the first place. Where were their gains? It's easy to see now the connection between this flawed peace treaty and the start of World War II, but those in charge of this treaty had no way to know something like World War II would ever happen. To them, the Paris peace talks solved all of the world's problems. It's easy to say in hindsight, oh, they should have done XYZ, but in reality, we have no way to know what our own thought process would have been if we experienced World War I, if we were in the room making decisions. World War I was the most destructive, expensive, and scary thing the world had ever experienced. How would you have handled a treaty with that much responsibility? I know that in your mind, what comes next is World War II, but we do still need to build up to that. In our next class, we'll be focusing on what's called the interwar period. What happened after the Treaty of Versailles is signed to make World War II possible. So, I'll see you then.